Hi, everybody. In introducing our keynote speaker tonight, I was kind of thinking about what the right context for her work is and for what she's going to be talking about tonight. And I thought mostly of kind of a refrain that I feel like you've probably heard a lot if you're involved in the game industry and with game development, which is that games would be much, much better if they put perhaps a higher value on good writing. As someone who's just started playing Destiny again, I have some sympathy for that perspective. So I kid because I love and I can't stop. But I think that just as often what's pointed out is that good writing is not necessarily something you can just order up. Unlike some other parts of game development, good writing is not necessarily something that you just throw more people at and it automatically is going to get better. People and money are not necessarily going to get you Shakespeare. And that there are people who devote their entire lives, right, to creating memorable moments, compelling characters, the kinds of things that we remember from the stories we've grown up with, from the stories that we've heard. And people devote their entire lives and sometimes fail to ever create anything that is up to their own standards. So this is all to say, right, that writing is very, very, very hard in and of itself. Just by itself is extremely difficult. And so it's remarkable that, when you take writing and you throw it into what we're all familiar with as the very tumultuous process of making a game, it's a miracle there are words and stories in games at all, perhaps. So it's in that context that I'm really happy and excited to introduce this first speaker of the weekend, who is the writer, and I suspect a game designer, on the game 80 Days, which is out on iOS and just came out on PC. For those of you who've played 80 Days, you probably know why we've invited her to speak here, but if you haven't, I'll just say that when 80 Days was suggested to me by my friend Kevin Kansian, the first thing he told me was, this is not only a sort of great, brilliant game, but it just has some of the best writing I've ever encountered. And I really couldn't agree more. I think the script for 80 Days is not just an example of great writing, but great writing that has a sort of attention and a concern about the rhythms and the expectations and the traditions of players and of a game and of the format. It's good writing that is also great design. And however we feel about the disciplines of writing, about game design and where they meet and where they don't meet, what are the friction points, I think that in 80 Days you see writing that is the product of someone who is not only a great writer but a great game designer. And I think we can all agree that that is extremely rare and something that is really truly valuable in our industry. So I'm going to say again how happy and excited I am to introduce the first speaker for Practice 2015, Meg Jayanth.
Wow, all the British in me just curdled up. That was excruciating, but thank you, Charles. All right, okay. Thank you. Plugging things that I'm good at. All right. Okay. So, I forgot the first thing that they told me, which is hold the mic up to your face. All right. So, thank you so much. I'm really excited to be here. This is my first time at Practice, so it's pretty exciting to be giving a talk at it at the same time. So, I'm going to be talking about 80 Days and unfairness in games kind of more generally, but I want to talk specifically about how we use unfairness, like how 80 Days is unfairness is core to 80 Days, kind of narratively, mechanically, and thematically. So I'm going to assume that most of you have played 80 Days, but if you haven't, here's a quick sum up. That's what the thumbnail looks like. So a quick sum up for anyone who isn't familiar with 80 Days. 80 Days is a massively branching, choice-driven game, and it's mostly told through text and minimal stylish graphics. It's a steampunk anti-colonial retelling of the Jules Verne novel Around the World in 80 Days, though our game has about 10 times as many words in it. You, the player, are not playing the grand adventure of Phileas Fogg. You're playing his valet, Passepartout. And so you choose routes, you pick conversational options, and you attend to your master's health as you try and make it around the world. So as the player, you have a big overarching goal. Make it around the world in 80 days, get back to London. And you can have some broad strategies, like, I'm going to go via Russia, or here we go, yeah. So I'm going to go via Russia, and I'm going to go down through Africa. But frankly, 80 days is a game of tactics, not strategy. If you aim for a particular city or route, the chances are is that you will be derailed. So you have to accept arbitrariness and unpredictability. You have to plan loosely and expect upset, catastrophe, and perhaps even opportunity. So this is a mechanical, ludic expression of the core theme of our game, the serendipity of travel. So, wow. Anyway, so 80 Days is it's like a simplified mimesis of the wonder and danger of travel. In the 19th century, yes, but kind of more generally, just travel and more generally. So Catherine Cross, in her article about our PC expansion on Off-World, uses the word precarity to describe kind of the nature of travel. And that's a really great word. Precarity and serendipity are what we try and replicate. So part of the way in which we do this is by hiding from the player what choices are going to have a mechanical effect. So giving them blind or opaque choices. So you never know whether picking a particular option will lead to a kind of mechanical advantage or not. You don't know which choice will result in a lasting consequence. And you also don't know what you may have missed. But you can catch enough glimpses and slivers to know that there is more to the world out there. But basically by choosing to follow the red-haired spy, you're missing out on the story of the gruff-voiced artificer. So each choice feels fraught and weighted from the player's perspective. And the story of your game, this is a point that I totally stole from Emily Short, who made this point at the last panel we were at the London Book Fair. So the story of your game is not only the story of what you did, but also the story of what you didn't do and what you missed out on. And sometimes because you chose to turn away, but at other times for reasons that are opaque to you as a player. So as much as we give you control, we also wrest it away. And by placing you in this kind of uncertain position, I think is exactly what makes the game thrilling or tense or unpredictable, if it ever is. And it allows for the possibility of surprise. Serendipity thrives on the possibility of surprise. But the true enemy of serendipity is fairness. 80 Days has to be unfair because unfairness allows for uncertainty. It allows for tension and it allows for risk. Every choice has to contain within it the possibility of unexpected success or unmitigated disaster. So many of the choices we offer players are deliberately unfair. As in there's no way for players to predict what the outcome is or whether it will have a particular consequence when they're making the choice. So they are by necessity making choices based on incomplete and often deliberately occluded or even outright false data, which is kind of a fancy way of saying that we lie to the player, sometimes right to their faces, but quite often by omission. So mostly the game lies because of its own complexity. So the scale and the depth of the interconnections between things, the sheer multiplicity of choice and the scope of the interweave consequence, and the mix of authored and procedural content make it incredibly hard to replicate particular routes or trades or moments. And that doesn't just apply to players, but also the team that made it as well. So when we were playing through, in order to playtest the game, there's too much complexity to kind of keep it all in our own heads. I think the moment that we knew that we had something interesting on our hands was when John Ingold, who's my co-writer on the game and the co-founder of Inkle, was playing through, and he got kicked out of a train journey across America because he was rude to a waiter. And he'd written that encounter, but he got so into the roleplay and kind of forgot that happened, that he got kicked out, and he was very upset about it, but it was his own fault. So, right. So because, so I couldn't game the game when I was playing it through, and I wrote most of the damn thing. And so I think if you're in that space, if I couldn't game it, then probably our players wouldn't be able to do it as well. So we were making a game and a world that could surprise players over and over again. So sometimes also, I gotta say, we do lie to you just for the hell of it. And I think that's pretty great. Like, games very rarely lie to you, and characters in games very rarely lie to you. So the conversation game, so if you've played this, you'll realize that quite a lot of the things that happen in the conversation game, they will often give you like clues, like, hey, if you wanna go to Lima, the best way is through Brisbane. Most of the clues that are in the conversation game are lies. There are some truths, like maybe 10%. So John is responsible for most of the conversation game. So, and I'm responsible for the 10% that's true because I'm a nice person, and John just like lied, and it's actually so great. And as I was playing it, I realized that was a really smart design choice. Because I think it shatters the players' assumptions because they're so used to games telling them exactly what they need to do, right? To giving them appropriate directions and helpful hints. And when they see something in our game and they realize that it is lied to them, it kind of defamiliarizes them and it forces them to engage their own logic, their great geographical knowledge, and actually use their own judgment, and kind of treat the characters that they encounter as having some sort of personhood. Like, they're not just there to serve you and give you hints. They might have their own agendas and they might just lie to you because they don't give a shit about you, basically. So we kind of, this way is one of the ways in which we encourage players to use their own judgment rather than just accepting what the game tells them. So players learn to distrust 80 Days, and that's kind of a marvelous thing. I think it's actually a mark of respect. So on one of the routes, as you're traveling by car, in kind of going back to Unfair Choices, in one of the routes as you're traveling by car in the German Empire, a shadow appears overhead and resolves into an airship with these enormous grappling arms, and it tries to seize the car that you're in and kind of like ingest it into the airship, basically. So, and basically kidnap you. So most players who play through 80 Days and encounter this are kidnapped, and then they're diverted to different destinations depending on their conversation with the dashing airship captain, Behir bin Qasim. There's no way to predict this abduction, right? When you're taking the route from Munich to Berlin, which is actually the route, I shouldn't have told you that. Spoilers. When you take that route, there is no way to know that, like, oh God, an airship is going to come and like snatch you, from the ground. It's entirely unfair. It's an entirely unfair event. It's something that we kind of do to you as the player. But because the player has made so many decisions about routes, about strategy, about narrative, about their own presentation, they've made all those decisions to lead them to this particular moment. Being grabbed up feels unexpected and thrilling rather than unfair, even though it is. So the reason for that is because they know we didn't railroad them into taking this route. There were many other routes they could have chosen. And the game shows them that there are other ways, other choices that they could have made. They're responsible for their choices, even if they couldn't predict this particular outcome. So we kind of make them feel like it's their responsibility they got kidnapped. And we drive that home by giving players a chance to escape. So just as long as you pass a skill check and make the right choices and you haven't weighted your car down with more than one suitcase. So the thing is, the way in which we structure this escape option, we ensure that most players are going to fail it. We kind of set you up here, but we also set you up to feel like it's your fault, not ours, when you do fail. Because you didn't just make one big choice to end up where you did. You made 100 little ones, each one kind of edging you incrementally closer and closer to this outcome. Each one was a chance to have changed things or escape. The truth is, in 80 Days, we kind of set you up all the time. It's one of the weird things about people's brains work, about the way in which people's brains work, that players don't get angry about us stacking the odds in this way. They don't get angry that we manipulate you into an opium den in Hong Kong and into the conversation with Monsieur Fix, and we basically slip an opium pipe into your hands and kind of do everything but whisper, go on, take a hit, it'll feel so good. I mean, they get angry when they actually get angry when they succumb to it. They get angry at themselves. And they're inordinately proud of themselves when they succeed. players blame themselves because they see their failings as personal and individual rather than as the result of systems. Which has kind of just reminded me of something that I see over and over again in discussions about privilege and race and gender. You know, so much of the misery and pain that exists out there is a result of systemic issues, but no one wants to see themselves as a cog, either as part of an oppressive machine or as a victim of it. But okay, the truth in 80 Days, though, is that we did manipulate you. We didn't give you an option. If we didn't give you an option as to whether to smoke the opium or not, if you just woke up having been drugged and abandoned on the Jade Tiger without your master, our players wouldn't have accepted it. They'd have been up in arms. Showing them that it was possible to escape the trap, even if that hope is infinitesimal, is kind of the spoonful of sugar that makes the unfairness go down. And we punish you by making you punish yourselves. People are weird. This kind of explains the urge to gamble, though, right? I mean, gambling in a casino is still fun for some people, even though the house always wins. I mean, that's a truism. We know the house always wins. And actually, it's kind of sweeter winning when you know the odds are stacked against you. And it's kind of hard to blame the house when you lose, because you knew it was unfair going in. They didn't hide that from you. But unlike in a casino, whose goal is to, you know, keep you playing and take your money, in 80 Days, our goal is to give you a good story. So, you know, slightly less evil. Slightly. But so 80 Days is kind of more akin to like a good GM playing a tabletop RPG. We use unfairness to give you a better experience, to set you up for drama and intrigue and fun as well as failure. Stacking the odds so that you'll encounter particular storylines or elements in a particular order, or playing out or subverting ideas that you encounter in one place or another. So our Eurogamer review kind of picked up on this. So here we go. What is a trip around the world of the 19th century if not a journey into the unknown? And while most of the choices you make in most games traditionally require a clear sense of what you're actually picking between, 80 Days often does away with that with thrilling effect. Thrilling effect, he says. So it must be true. So yeah. So that's all great, and I have no quarrel with it. And this is a really great review. But it kind of goes on to say that this tendency towards unfairness and arbitrariness marks 80 Days out as a game that prefers the rules of fiction to the rules of games. Now, this is kind of a really interesting idea, and I couldn't let go of this. It kind of niggled at me after I read this review. There's an instinctive way in which we kind of understand what the review is getting at. But how are we to define the rules of fiction and the rules of games, especially if they're set against each other like this? And the more I thought about it, the more that I realized that arbitrariness and unfairness, blind choices, are actually, I think, much more inherent to games than they are to fiction more broadly. Games of luck and chance, board games, card games, gambling, right? So 80 Days maybe then prefers the rules of board games to video games. That might be a better way to put it. So I'm going to say something that I thought I'd never say, which is that actually, I think 80 Days has more in common with Candy Crush than it does with most other interactive fiction or video games. Before you laugh me out of here, I'm going to steal the words of someone cleverer than me to help make my point. So this is Tevis Thompson in Grantland talking about Candy Crush and what he calls radical unfairness. And the way in which he describes it makes it sound eerily like 80 Days. So here we go. At the level of the individual move, nothing is assured. You can make the best moves and still lose. You can choose poorly and win. Every move is another chance, and it can go either way every time. Often you never even know whether a particular move was good or bad, only that it reconfigured the board, only that a series of choices led to advancement or staying stuck. This may sound like bad game design, punishing nominally good moves, rewarding accidents, and providing ambiguous feedback for most decisions, but this uncertainty and ambiguity is one of Candy Crush's biggest draws. So what's interesting here is that all the things that make 80 Days seem fictiony to players and to reviewers, the occluded choices, the ambiguous feedback, the deliberate deployment of uncertainty to the player experience, all of these supposedly fictiony attributes of 80 Days make Candy Crush seem gamey and systemic to their players. I think that in some ways, because the main mechanic of 80 Days, that of choice, is expressed through narrative text, it can make it harder to see how mechanical it is. Story is the mechanic in 80 Days. Choosing how to respond in certain situations is, when you strip it down to, when you strip it bare to function and structure, not in the least dissimilar to strategically arranging candy in matching rows. And on this subject, let's also not forget that how players react to unfairness and misfortune is also a matter of skill and not just luck. Adapting strategies and tactics to a new situation, taking advantage of unforeseen opportunities, taking your story so far in a new direction, staying calm in the face of video game crisis. These are all skills. And I think this kind of goes back to how, in some ways, I think we confuse fairness with balance. So 80 Days is deeply unfair, but it's also a very balanced game. In fact, the average playthrough is something like 79 days, which is pretty good when you consider all of the interlocking parts. And the act of balancing is actually an act of redistributing unfairness. It's tweaking the systems and rules. It's kind of cheating, just on a design level rather than on a play level. So if you can have an unfair game that's also balanced, then why is unfairness such a taboo? This is like a mild digression, but I kind of think that it's kind of to do with this rigid idea of winning, and also that winning is the only way in which you can enjoy a game. It isn't, or most people wouldn't play games. I mean, I'm really bad at most games, but I still really enjoy them, and I rarely win. So loads of us play games that we're bad at, and lots of us enjoy playing even if we don't beat all the levels or get to the end. Lots of us play to be social, or to create, or to relieve boredom or stress. We play for a variety of reasons. This is obvious and true. And the thing is, we can also win in a variety of ways. Whether a particular game allows for this or not, players are great at redefining the terms and playing games in a way that makes sense for them, creating their own definitions of success. And 80 Days kind of embraces this idea, so there are really multiple valid ways to play the game, multiple ways to win, multiple enjoyments outside of completion. I mean, you don't even fail when you hit the 80-day mark. You can just kind of continue exploring. And yes, of course, you can win by making it around the world, but you can also win by making it around the world, but without using any banks, or by visiting the maximum number of cities, or just exploring and getting lost in the Amazon jungle for 140 days, which someone actually totally did. Like 140, okay. I think they had fun though, so, it's fine. It's fine. Who am I to judge? So in our expansion, we actually added a few more end states, like many more end states than we had in the original game. And one of which is abandoning your quest and just living happily ever after in icy romance with Viti Jokinen, who's the artificer that you meet on the North Pole expedition, and you can choose to romance or not. And then you can kind of run into him again at this sort of meteorological outpost. And you can just choose to abandon your master and abandon the quest and just, live with your boyfriend. Just pretty cool, I think. And I think it's a hard thing for some people to reconcile, that you can have an end state that actually undermines the stated purpose and the primary drive of your game. I mean, it is in the title, 80 Days. But the thing is, this end state isn't a fail state, even though you abandon your quest. It's satisfying for some people. It works, and that's success as far as I'm concerned. That's as much winning as making it around the world. So let's take this back to the whole rules of games versus rules of story debate that we were having. And even if we take it at its broadest, kind of as a discussion about fiction and systems, which is, I think, kind of where it's going there. Looking at these two things, fiction and systems, as inimical as opposed is already impossible. We're not undermining the rules of the game or the world of the game or the systems of the game when we let you win by abandoning your quest. We're actually broadening it. So the thing is that the best systems account for edge cases and they make room for exceptions. And the best fictions have integrity and robustness and internal logic. Fiction requires structure, either as underpinnings or as a framework to push against. The more arbitrary and spontaneous 80 Days seems on the surface to the player, the more tightly structured and logic-driven and procedural it has to be underneath. It's kind of like wearing the right bra under the right dress, right? So they're performing different functions, but they're kind of going towards the same goal. So all of the engineering underneath is to make the red carpet gown look effortless. Totally not an excuse to leave a slide with Christina Hendricks up on the screen. But honestly, the shape of the player experience is determined by the structure underneath. Or to put it a bit more actively, the way in which we structure games, mechanically, dramatically, narratively, determines the player experience. So I want to go back to talking about how the various systems in 80 Days interact. But I'm going to drink some water first. You can just stare at Christina Hendricks. Cool. I planned this well. All right. So I think I used the phrase tightly structured before, but actually tight isn't the right word to use here. What I mean is that the way in which the games, the fiction and the systems interact it's robust, it's integrated. But the way in which our systems interact isn't brittle or inflexible, it's actually really loose. So I'll give you an example. Again, I really hope John Ingold doesn't see this talk because he's gonna kill me for revealing all this stuff. So there are actually only 3 qualities that we track throughout the game, persistently throughout the game, apart from time and money, of course. And that's the status of Fogg's relationship, your relationship with Fogg, rather, Passepartout's skill, and Passepartout's style. Individually and in combination, it's just these 3 persistent qualities that give us a huge number of effects in the game. And we squeeze all of the juice out of every variable or quality. Alexis Kennedy from Failbetter Games that make Fallen London and Sunless Sea, he calls this quality parsimony, which is a really lovely way of putting it. So these qualities themselves are pretty loose. And they're also loose in the way that they're applied. So for instance, that Fogg relationship quality covers both Fogg's feelings about you and also your feelings about Fogg. They both feed into the same variable. Style can refer to flamboyance in terms of dress or action or behavior. Fastidiousness about Passepartout's own fastidiousness about his own appearance can either increase or decrease flamboyance depending on context, which is, again, basically translates to at my whim. So we also don't have any rules for how many times we offer the player opportunities to increase or decrease certain skills within a city or within a journey, or how many skill checks there are. There's so much variance and possibility that there's no way to make this fair. So instead of chasing fairness and deforming our game in the pursuit of this impossibility, we just abandon it altogether. To write a good story in games or anywhere really, the goal, the purpose has to be to write a good story, right? That's the only way in which you're going to be able to do it. To say to a writer, the goal of your work is to evenly distribute skill checks within your fiction is to assassinate any possibility of art. It just freaking is. It is. That isn't to say that these concerns are antithetical to writing good stories. Writing interactive fiction necessitates an understanding and facility with mechanics and logic and systems, but that can't be the foundation or the animus for a writer's work. So for us, we called up and we used variables when they seemed appropriate in the course of writing. And then we did an editing pass for balance. But again, it was gut feeling that drove this. Our systems and narratives are deeply, inextricably intertwined, but that doesn't demand exactitude. In fact, as we said, it was easier for us to intertwine story and mechanics because we didn't have a metric or a quota. If you make it hard for yourself to do something, you're not going to do it. I know this sounds ridiculously obvious, but I honestly wish more game developers design their tools and processes like they were designing games. Like, if you wouldn't design a game like your development workflow or your authoring tool, then something has gone wrong. Like, you are setting yourself up to waste your time and your game developer's time and your writer's time and energy and creativity and effort because they're going to be wrangling with tools and process instead of making things. So Ink, which is what we use for 80 Days, which is Inkle's internal scripting language, it's brilliant because it just gets out of your way. It's designed to just let me write straight into a text file and for the most part pretty readably. And so that's where my focus was and that's where all of my energy went. So keeping it loose, sorry, it's the end of Christina Hendricks' time. So keeping it loose also has several advantages, right? So it makes it easy to have a lot of these intertwined moments, which is in itself desirable. So Asher Vollmer in his practice talk, I think it was last year, he talks about this. He has a really great quote that I think is really apposite. So he says, "Elegance is the resistance to compartmentalize things. All the features of the game are intertwined with each other," which is just really great, which is exactly what the state that you want to get to. And you need to make it easy for yourself to do that. And also keeping it loose allows you to drive the systemic interactions through story rather than a flowchart or a framework, which makes the end result feel more organic and exciting and polished and literary, possibly. And it also allows for specificity and particularity. So again, looking at fiction and systems as oppositional misses the point. The fact that 80 Days is all about specificity and particularity, that it allows exceptions to the rule, doesn't actually undermine how systemically driven it is. We responded to design and narrative problems by looking at the specificity of a situation rather than sanding down any jagged edges to better fill some narrative rule set or systemic ideal. So the design debate that we had around morality actually helps illustrate this. So there's no morality system in 80 Days. I don't think that will come as a surprise to anybody. And we never really intended there to be. We went into it knowing that that's not something we wanted to do. But as we drew to the end of the writing and development process, we looked over the game and saw maybe like 7 or 8 instances where you make a big moral choice. Basically, when Passepartout has a chance to do something really, truly terrible, like genuinely terrible. We don't give players a lot of opportunities to do this. I mean, it's 7 or 8 choices, 7 or 8 instances in like about 10,000. So, there aren't that many opportunities to be evil. And I think that's about right, because Passepartout isn't a bad person. There's no opportunity to play him as evil or a bad person because you just can't sustain evil for 10,000 choices. Evil is too one-dimensional. Evil, it just gets cartoonish, I think. But because these particular instances stood out, so one of them is if you choose to take a slaver ship in Brazil. Another one is to do with this runaway princess from an Ottoman harem. There's no good choice in that story, just no good choice. I really enjoyed writing it. One of them involves betraying an automaton with a soul to a sect of kidnapping nuns in India. Excellent. Someone has, paid the wages of sin for that choice. Good. That's what we like to hear. All right. So the thing is, these particular instances stand out, even in a game that has, plenty of moral choices. And so we were kind of tempted to somehow systematize this so that if a player reaches the end of the journey and has done one of these big choices, has made one of these big bad choices, we kind of bring it up to them, and we thought maybe we could just make them feel guilty and remorseful and kind of just rub salt in their wounds, which really had a lot of appeal. Or we could ask them to justify their actions and kind of say, looking back, did I do the right thing? Would I have done that again? That kind of thing. We even kind of vaguely toyed with the idea of, maybe we could actually punish you if you're on the last leg of your journey and you've done something really horrible, you just get 2 days delay for making a bad choice. We abandoned that pretty quick. In the end, we discarded all of these ideas and, for the good, I think, because it's much better to put the consequences of the action closer to the event and to keep them individual in particular than try and pull them into some sort of larger system or structure. And more importantly, any potential gains were massively outweighed by the fact that just by picking out these 6 or 7 instances and emphasizing their importance to the player, we would be reducing in the player's mind the importance of every single other choice that they made. We would essentially be deciding for them what kind of game they were playing, what the most important parts of their experience were. And chances are we'd be right some of the time, but we'd also be, in identifying what the hardest choices that players made were, but we'd also be wrong. 80 Days works because it allows space for the player within it. We rely on the player's brain to do a lot of work for us, to build connections, to offer justifications, to fill in the sketches of character and incident that we offer them into a kind of vibrant whole. And all of that work, all of that collaboratively created fantasy that sustains our player experience would be shattered the moment we contradicted it with something like this. So this is the most important part of the design of 80 Days. if you look at it this way, and it's about restraint. There's this tendency to kind of over-explain, to over-specify, to kind of try and justify design choices to the player as you're making them. And that's, I think, that would have been a mistake. 80 Days bends and breaks and ignores the rules, but we do it kind of blithely. And by and large, players just don't notice. They just don't care. We never try and make excuses, so they don't even realize that there's something that we had to make excuses for. We never let them know that we're not meant to be doing this, so they don't notice when we do. Because the rules of the story and the rules of systems just aren't. It's kind of like the Pirates Code. They're more guidelines than rules. As I put in this slide, I realized there are probably people in the audience that are too young to have ever watched Pirates of the Caribbean, Curse of the Black Pearl, and it made me so fucking sad. Sorry, I shouldn't. I had to go eat ice cream. It was like, anyway. So the real point here is that all of the design methodologies and discourses on best practice and writing guidelines are all just that. They're guidelines. Applying them too strictly is as bad as discarding them altogether. In that shifting balance between rules and subversion, between skill and luck, between determinism and chaos, lies the, to extend the metaphor beyond comprehension, treasure. So looking at the rules as guidelines, allowing for flexibility and exceptions and arbitrariness, to me feel like a much more human and humane way of looking at design. To me, there's something suspicious about the very idea of fairness. It's like the idea of neutrality or objectivity. They're concepts that it kind of feels like only certain people get to deploy in very specific circumstances. So the very idea that fairness is possible is kind of a power fantasy. And it's certainly a fantasy of dominant culture. You know, the fantasy that if you work hard and you do everything right, you'll win. Most games emulate and reinforce this idea. And going back to Tavis Thompson in his article about Candy Crush, he calls this a fairness fantasy, which is just a really great way to put it. So, and what he says about this is, if ever a game is cheap or unfair, this is a cardinal sin, a provocation to rage quit, for the entire system is predicated on the understanding that gaming is a hermetically sealed bubble of justice. And within this bubble, players are closet deists, and their gods are always fair. This is a wonderful way to describe the kind of a certain kind of hardcore mindset, right? And okay, so part of me also kind of suspects that there's a link, that there is a link between games' obsession with fairness and optimization. And that's because games are overwhelmingly made by straight, white, cisgender, middle-class dudes. I think the rest of us are kind of more used to unfairness. We really expect it. Like, precarity and arbitrariness are just kind of part of the structure of our lives. And as for optimization, I think we all know that success comes at a cost, always. Games that are fair, games that you can win on the terms that the games expect you to, games that you can work out and min-max and optimize are a fantasy of dominant culture, because in the real world, fairness is unevenly distributed. Fairness is not just part of the power fantasy of games, but it also replicates the myths of dominant culture uncritically. You can win, there's an even playing field. All that matters is skill and effort. And the shadow of those ideas, if you lose, either in games or in life, that's because you didn't try hard enough. So video games are artifacts of dominant culture. How could they not be? And it's no surprise to me that hardcore gamers, mostly straight white dudes, are sore losers. It's no surprise that they get angry when their games feel unfair. They're not as used to the idea that the odds might be stacked against them, like the rest of us are. And right, before the enraged tweets roll in... Okay, we've covered that. So this is interesting. So John Scalzi, when he's trying to explain privilege to straight white dudes without using the word privilege, he has this amazing post that you might have seen, but he says, so in the role-playing game known as the real world, straight white male is the lowest difficulty setting there is. This means that the default behaviors for almost all the non-player characters in the game are easier on you than they would be otherwise. The default barriers for completion of quests are lower. Your leveling up thresholds come more quickly. You automatically gain entry to some parts of the map that others have to work for. The game is easier to play automatically, and when you need help, by default, it's easier to get. So this is a great quote because Scalzi basically identifies exactly what we subvert in 80 Days and what we deliberately subvert, right? We don't let Passepartout's, perceived whiteness and masculinity go unmarked. And we actually mark bits of the map off limits because of them. We have players deny you authority and question your motives because of it. Whiteness and masculinity make you an outsider in 80 Days more often than it allows you within the circle. We remind the player of Passepartout's limitations. He's been playing on the easiest setting. Does he really have the right to recommend strategies to or to judge people playing on Nightmare mode? So, yeah, just accuracy. So part of the fairness fantasy is also the idea that if something is broken, it can be fixed. So this is really interesting because games video games especially teach players to solve problems. They teach you to expect possible, achievable solutions. And there are a few moments in 80 Days where we subvert that and where we deny this to the players. And it's been really interesting to watch players talk about and discuss these incidents in forums and in reviews. So the one that always comes up is in Brisbane, you can encounter a girl from the indigenous Murri tribe. She's working as a maid in the hotel that you're staying at. You can engage her in conversation, and she tells you about the depredations her people have suffered as a result of colonialization. And she has written a complaint outlining these depredations, which she wants to get printed in the local newspaper, which is the Moreton Bay Courier. Because she wants to gain attention for this cause and for her people. And you, as Passepartout, you realize that it's unlikely that the white settler-owned newspaper is going to print this note, right? Especially not on the request of an Aboriginal girl. And so one of the options is you can offer to take her letter to the newspaper offices yourself and use your whiteness and your maleness and your position to help her. But she refuses. Okay, she says no, she doesn't trust you because you are an outsider, you're white, you're a dude, you're a tourist. You are closer to the oppressor than you are to her. And all the good intentions in the world can't change that. And what's wonderful and perfectly understandable is that there's a heated debate in various forums about how to get the Murri girl to trust you with her letter. Yeah, of course, so win the favor of the Murri girl, which is great. And the thing is, it's I don't want to criticize these people because this is exactly what games expect you to do. They're just living up to the expectations of games, and we're the ones who are kind of subverting it. So it isn't surprising because games train you to fix problems, or rather, they kind of teach you that all problems can be fixed, and that all problems can be fixed by you, right? If you try hard enough. But in this case, it's not your problem, and you can't fix it. So here we go. I mean, this is the ink, so this is behind the scenes. So this is where if you offer to take it for her, and basically whatever you say, she says no. So solving it using your white privilege would actually just make your solution part of the problem. You can't ride to her rescue. You cannot solve racism by posting a single letter. You can't get past years of ingrained distrust of whiteness and your ignorance of local culture and politics in the course of one conversation. She is never going to open up to you no matter what item you try and use from your travels. That's been a really fun thing as well. They're like, right, so she's a revolutionary, right? So maybe if we get this revolutionary flag and give it to her, she'll realize that we're on the side of revolution. It's kind of amazing. People have just found so many solutions to a problem which has none, which is just amazing. And actually, awesomely enough, I checked the thread on our wiki as I was putting this slide together, and just 7 hours before I put this together, someone posted this. Maybe it's a life lesson. Sometimes, no matter what you try and do to help, bad things will happen. Thank you, anonymous Wikia contributor. This is not a bug. This is the entire point of the game. But it's such an unfamiliar notion to gamers that they will be shown something wrong and not allowed to fix it. It feels unfair to them, catastrophically unfair, to be denied their fairness fantasy, to be denied their white savior fantasy. Hell, even to be denied a conclusion of a story feels unfair. And that is great, and that is good. That pinch of unfairness, that confusion and dawning outrage, we want you to feel that. Maybe it will even be good for you. And this is hardly the last of the unfairnesses that we perpetrate upon the player. We deliberately work to undermine your expectations, and we kind of have to work really hard and approach it from many angles because the fairness fantasy is so ingrained in us. So look at the North Pole expansion. This is content we released Christmas after we released the game. It's one of the most full and epic narrative arcs in the game, and it also employs quite a few mechanics and story elements that you don't encounter anywhere else. So going into that expedition, we warn you, like, be careful, this route is dangerous, don't do it if you're not ready. And okay, spoilers, the route lives up to that because it is entirely possible, even likely, that if you are unprepared or you make the wrong choices, Fog will die. And there's nowhere else in the game that this happens, no matter, and so what is hilarious is that because there are no, you can get into dire situations in the rest of the game and Fog kind of scrapes through and pulls through, players often don't take our warning seriously. They think it would be unfair for them to change something so fundamental. They wouldn't just kill you out of nowhere. It must just be a way of ratcheting up the tension. And that's why it's a sucker punch when the game breaks the rules and Fog dies a slow, excruciating, agonizing, icy death. So maybe a better way to put this would be that we redefine the contract rather than breaking it. It isn't a betrayal. It's it's a revelation. This is not the game that you thought you were playing. It's something else altogether. Hatterful Boyfriend, the game of pigeon romance, right, is great at doing this for the bad boys love route. The game and this particular character constantly warn you that this pigeon is dangerous. He's suspicious, he's monstrous, but the genre conventions of visual novels lead you to interpret this as a coded invitation. Either he'll turn out to be like misunderstood or you'll redeem him with love, but if you continue pursuing this romance, he murders and dismembers you. It's so great. You can't play the game the same way after this, even if you reload. The dismembering kind of lingers, right? All bets are off. Suddenly you're hyper aware of the genre conventions and the rules and the mechanics of the game in a way that you weren't before. It's a defamiliarization technique, like I talked about before. I'll leave up this super pretentious slide and you can just read it in your own time. So these are all ways in which we subvert the power fantasy, the white savior fantasy, through our protagonist. Though our protagonist and his primary companion are both, well, white-ish dudes, we use the other characters and cultures you encounter in the world to examine and highlight some of the unevenness, some of the unfairnesses that exist. To explore the situation of people of color, women, minorities, and queer people without reducing them to background decoration or set dressing. At times, the game is unfair to Passepartout in favor of the NPCs. At times, we steal agency from our straightish, whitish dude protagonists and give it to other characters. So, for instance, there are even times where we taunt a player with story and then deny it to them, which kind of messes with the player's expectations for a story, right? We set up Chekhov's gun, but we don't fire it. And it kind of messes with the definitions of good storytelling, but it's probably not the best story we could have possibly told, but it's done that way for a purpose. And that purpose is more important than narrative satisfaction. So on a journey from Belém to Freetown, you take passage on this Asante airship, and the captain is blind. He used to be a soldier in the Asante armies, but then he retired to captain this airship after his injury. And we kind of hint at this intriguing backstory, how did he go blind? Was it a feat of daring do? It must have been really epic. Is he happy? Is he full of regret for what he lost? All of this stuff. And on the second day, you have the opportunity to ask his second command, Essen, how the captain was injured. And all he says in response to you is, this is not a story for a stranger. There is no way to get Essen to tell you this story. It's not for you. We use a similar technique in the Brisbane to Lima journey, where Fog is the recipient of the amorous attentions of two ladies in competition. And you, Passepartout, you're kind of trying to foil their schemes. But on the last day, you get locked in a compartment for several hours, and then when you get let out and you're disembarking, we allow you to speculate on what may have happened between Fog and either or even both of the ladies, depending on your Fog. So we taunt you with the possibility of this story again, but in this case, we deny you the confirmation of the story for titillation, right? It's better to imply than confirm. It makes for a better story. But for the captain of the Asante airship, we actually give you a worse story in order to respect the integrity and agency and personhood of that particular NPC. And to do that, we reduce Passepartout's control and agency over him and his crew. This is kind of what I think of as one of the myths of equality and multiculturalism and feminism that you really can't deny in game design, that if you want someone who was previously silent to speak, someone else might have to shut up for a while. So we went in wanting to be respectful to other cultures, other peoples, and characters, and that resulted in compromise. Sometimes we ended up telling a less good story. Sometimes we had to discard a fun idea. Sometimes we made mechanical compromises so that we didn't have to make ethical ones. There are costs to being respectful. There are costs to being inclusive. Sometimes being ethical is hard work, and we shouldn't pretend that it isn't. It's still worth doing, but pretending that it's easy doesn't do anyone any favors, I don't think anyway. It's like, I don't know, like being a good game designer is freaking hard. So why would we expect being a decent person to be easier? And kind of trying to be a good person and a good game designer at the same time, well, I hope you enjoy Stress and Sleepless Nights. So 80 Days acknowledges the unfairness of the fictional world and deliberately subjects its player to narrative and mechanical unfairness. And to heap further ignominy upon it, while we're being capriciously and proudly unfair to you, the player, we rarely let the player, as Passepartout, be unfair to the peoples and cultures that you encounter, and certainly not without challenging those attitudes. But this isn't ironic and it isn't gratuitous. In the real world, fairness is not distributed equally, and it certainly wasn't so in the 19th century. Why would we want to replicate that wholly and punch down? It felt to us more unfair than inconveniencing the player by diverting them from Khartoum to Suez unexpectedly, or blowing up the fictional engine of their fictional steamer. So unfairness is a theme that we explore over and over again in our narrative. Going back to that earlier point about how fairness is unevenly distributed, we set out to make a game in which the protagonist story of going around the world isn't necessarily the most important or the most interesting one available to the player. We wanted to make a game where the stories of queer people and women and people of color and minorities are given voice, where their struggles are acknowledged rather than erased, but it's also a world in which technological invention is more globally distributed, and that redistribution allows us to alter the balance of power away from the British Empire and to indigenous cultures and colonized peoples. We use the fantasy to redress some of the unfairness of colonialism to enable us to kind of tell the stories that we wanted to tell. So in the world building, we kind of do the inverse of what we do to the player. We make the world more fair to indigenous cultures and colonized people. But these drives aren't contradictory. They both work towards the same purpose, to undermine the power fantasy, the fantasy of white history, the fantasy of imperialism. Because the imperial fantasy requires the struggles of colonized people and people of color and women and working class people and minorities. It requires that these are either ignored or that they're enshrined in pornographic narratives of victimhood and suffering. And victimhood is all-encompassing. Victimhood is reducing. Victims exist to be saved or pitied but never respected. Victims are acted upon rather than acting. Victims are quintessential NPCs. And we had to work deliberately and specifically to undermine that dangerous paradigm in the way that we designed and deployed our characters and the way in which we structured our incidents and encounters. We kind of had to come to an almost entirely new understanding of the meaning of protagonism and agency, outside of primacy, outside of the simulation of entitlement, a definition of agency that could assimilate a loss of control, that could assimilate unfairness. And fundamentally, I kind of think what we learned was that you can respect your player without necessarily giving them what they want. And that actually sometimes truly respecting your player necessitates not giving them what they want. And that's my talk. Excellent. All right. Thank you. Probably more Christina Hendricks than you expected, huh? All right, excellent. Do I have time for questions? For a few, yeah. Yeah? Does anyone have any? I mean, I've talked at you for like a long time now, so it's okay if you don't have any questions. It's also okay if you do. Excellent. You, sir, over there.
I really loved your point about this idea of subverting this expectation of fairness.
Yeah.
And how much of a kind of core assumption that is amongst games players.
Mhm.
amongst designers. And I thought that was really crucial. And it was crucial to my experience of playing the game as well.
Hmm.
I was thinking about, could you have designed a game that subverted that expectation and given it a protagonist who was a woman or a protagonist of color? Would it still have had the same effect, or did it make it essential that the protagonist of the game was white and male?
I mean, I think in this specific instance, it kind of did. I mean, all of those elements work thematically really well together. I think if we'd made the protagonist a woman, it would have been, I mean, in some ways, like there would have been a similar kind of, denial of access to certain spaces and stuff like that. But we'd have probably weighted it in the opposite way and kind of attempted to, you'd go to a place and you'd expect to be denied because you're a woman, but actually, like, things would have been more even and equal. But actually, in a weird way, having a kind of white protagonist really helped us because we could be a little bit more honest, and it helped us maintain. So for us, respectfulness necessitated a kind of balance between, actually confronting and engaging with things like slavery and oppression and bigotry as they actually existed, and not wanting to just perpetuate narratives of victimhood. So we did want to, actually give a chance for sort of people outside the straight white male paradigm to be heroes, to have agency, to have power, to have like cool stories, like to be airship captains and, and engineers and all of this stuff. But we that's always a balance that we kind of struggled with, and we just had to keep it working in that way. So I think that's the thing, is that I think we could have done it with a non-white protagonist, we could have done it with a female protagonist, but it would have altered the balance of all of the other elements, basically. It's not like the most useful answer. It's like, yeah, I mean, stuff would have changed. It's complicated. But yeah, excellent. Go ahead.
Kind of a question more about like development.
Yeah, sure.
It's really interesting to me that it seems like this political, message that you're trying to express in the game seems like a real anchor for the way it's being designed.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just wondering at what point in the process that kind of became the focus.
So it was kind of intrinsic to it, straight from the beginning. So probably my involvement in the project, so John and Joe, who are the co-founders of Inkle, came to me with this story idea in summer, not last year, the year before that. Yes, the year before that. And I actually started working on the game about 3 or 4 months before development started, because they were working on Sorcery 2 and getting it up. So I started doing research and world building and started creating content, which was all, and thinking about how we're going to approach the world. And because my central problem really was like, what the hell am I going to do with Auda? Who, if you've ever read the Jules Verne novel, she's like the Indian princess that Fogg encounters in India, and she's like this horrifying, she's like deracinated figure, this kind of conquered territory, and she's like a prize for Fogg, like, yeah, you made it around the world, here, have an Indian princess bride. So I went into it kind of knowing that I wanted to create a game world in which Auda would be able to have her own agency, her own story, her own power, that she wouldn't be limited by that. So the whole thing was structured in order to give, Auda and people like her agency and power. And because I got to work on it earlier, and then so by the time John and Joe kind of shifted focus and then started thinking about like how are we going to design this, what shape is the game going to take, they already had so much of this there. It altered the way they went into the design process. And I was involved in it kind of the entire way through. Like, so their we were all on HipChat together kind of for the 9 months of development. And we went back and forth and discussed like design and narrative issues kind of constantly, and and John was doing some of the writing as well as like, looking at development and mechanics. And in no way did they totally welcome me into the design conversation. And I think that's why it feels so integrated. So does that answer your question? So I realized it just kind of went anyway, thank you. Excellent. You over there. I'm sorry, I feel so rude pointing, going, you over there. Speak. Sorry.
Narrative content for this
Yeah.
game. And I'm wondering if there were any storylines or sort of threads that you really loved, but you ended up cutting, and if so, why?
oh wow, no, you don't cut everything. Like that was John's initial advice to me, because he's very used to he's used ink before, and he was writing Sorcery, which also has like quite a lot of content in it. Each one of them like increases by several factors. And he was like, his initial thing to me was like, just write everything, Meg. Just write everything. Write everything. And I looked at him with like pity, and I was like, no, John, I'm gonna do a job on this. Like, I'm only gonna put stuff that I'm really proud of in there. 4 months in, I was like, God, I'm just gonna write everything. Actually, the one thing that we did cut, like I did cut something, which was in the Arctic, the Viti romance. I wrote a much raunchier version. It exists, and it's for my own pleasure. But yeah, and then basically I had to be like, oh no shit, like Victorian sensibilities, and then me and John and my partner was a content editor on it, and he was like, you know, like you use Victorian sensibilities everywhere else, and I basically just used the Victorian sensibilities excuse to John when so there's a section where you can help an airship captain give birth, and I wrote that section, and then John whose wife just had a baby, like got back to me after that and was like, yeah, Meg, do you want a realistic version of this? Because I'll write you one. And I was like, no. Victorian sensibility, John. Let's draw the veil over it. So he pretty much turned that around on me and was like, Victorian sensibility, Meg, come on. So yeah, so that's the only thing that didn't make it in. Excellent, yes.
So when writing, how do you distinguish between unfairness that's just gratuitous and mean to the player, and unfairness that's interesting and subversive?
Yeah, I guess it's kind of a case by case thing, and you get a feel for it after a certain point in time. I mean, in a lot of cases, it came out of, it was a game that we iterated a lot over time. And there are certainly sections where we are kind of closer to one extent or the other, like closer to the extremes that we discussed quite a lot and changed. So, I mean, there's one section where this slaver section, like if you get on the slaver ship, I talked about this a little in my GDC talk, so apologies if you heard this before. If you get on the slaver ship, you get to your destination faster, but when you get to the destination, like no one wants to take you any further because they saw you coming on the slaver ship and they're like, wow, you're dicks, basically. And the only kind of option to progress is that you end up on this really horrible, deliberately kind of gruesome and awful slave catching expedition, right? And there's a moment in there where, so I went into it being like, right, I really don't want you to at all have a kind of be able to play out this white savior fantasy. You cannot save these slaves. You can't do anything about it. You have to just witness this thing happening. Like that's the kind of narrative penance that you're paying. You're there to be a witness. And John very rightly kind of came back to me and said, this is great and that's really valid, but if you don't offer players options, if you don't even give them the opportunity to kind of do something, to act, they're just going to skim the text. And he was really worried that it just wouldn't be as affecting to the player if they just didn't have any kind of way in and hook in. And that was a really good point. And the creative compromise that we came up with, I think, actually makes it much stronger. So instead what we have is a kind of like atonement style sequence where you save the slaves and you kill the woman who's the head of the slave catching expedition, and you set them all free and everything's lovely, except then, right at the end you confess, like, I did nothing and this is horrible and I wish this were true, but this was just a fantasy that I had. And that's like a kind of a double gut punch to the player, and it's great. But it also but the thing is, like, that kind of unfairness works, whereas the unfairness of just not allowing you to do anything wouldn't have worked. Like, we can give you the option to do something and then pull back from that. But so that's the thing, is that it's kind of one, and then once you have that conversation, once you kind of have a sense of that and understanding, it just becomes easier to look at a situation and kind of see what kind of unfairness would work. This is, it's really hard to put into words, I suppose, and describe, but it was very much through looking at those individual moments, I guess, which is like super helpful to everyone else. I'm really sorry. I should basically just have a Tumblr where I'm like, is your interactive fiction fair or unfair? Run your choices by me, I'll tell you. I would do that. That would be fun. Excellent. Right. Anyone else? Any other questions? Yes.
I'm just curious, what is your process for keeping track of so many interwoven storylines? Because obviously the game has an immense amount of content that's, I can, and I think comparing that as well with like how big the world is and how
Yeah.
the micro stories that you only see one person for,
Mhm.
whereas there's a recurring like effects. Like,
Yeah.
what's your best tool or process for keeping track of all of that?
So there basically isn't, and I think that's the whole point. Like, there's no flow chart. Like, John and Joe are really fond of saying our flow chart was the globe. Like, that's actually how we started looking at, like, oh, so what cities are we going to write? Just got open Google, like a shared Google map, and we're like, yeah, here, and just started putting pins in. I mean, the thing is, if I could have kept track of the complexity, that means that a player can do that. And would do that really quickly. Like, maybe not on the first playthrough, but certainly on the second. So you just have to, I think we just wrote it organically, and Ink, the system, just makes it so easy to call up variables that occurred previously, that, basically every choice, every like little micro choice is remembered really easily. So I don't have to like note down, like, remember that you remember whether you looked up at the sky, like remember whether Passepartout was happy to be underwater or sad. I can just kind of just call that up really easily. And we did also have like an editing process, like after we finished writing most of the content, where we deliberately started as we were kind of editing for like typos and stuff like that and sense. We also, because we were doing it all at once, it was easier to keep in mind. So like, when we'd encounter, oh, look, you can travel underwater in this submarine here. You've just read another bit where you've traveled underwater in a submarine, so it's quite easy to kind of go, oh, I'll just add a sentence as to whether you've done that before and how you felt about it. So a lot of it is really, really manual and bespoke, but there's no real system for it.
Okay.
Yeah. Excellent. Anyone else? Questions? Yes?
Is Ink available to the public?
So Inkle Writer is available to the public. So that's an authoring tool. You can just find it on Inkle Studios' website. Inkle Writer is kind of a public-facing, like more user-friendly and visual version of Ink. It's slightly less powerful, but it's still like really, really great and really useful. I know that John and Joe would like love to release Ink, but it would just require so much time and effort of maintenance, because apparently like it's sort of iterated so many times, and there were moments where John was just like, you don't want to know how I put this variable in. You just don't want to know, Meg. It's like, so it sounded brutal. So yeah.
One more? Got time? I think we have time for one more.
Excellent. One more. Okay, no pressure. I mean, make it a good one. Just saying.
You want to step up?
Wow, really? Excellent, Charles.
Frank, one more question.
Right, okay.
I have a question. So a lot of your process
Mhm.
seems very bespoke, and I assume that part of what makes that easier and more manageable is team size.
Yes.
What do you have thoughts, having been through this process
Mhm.
now, of does this scale? How would it scale? If you imagine doing a game that's at a sort of larger scope,
Yeah.
in 20 days, do you have thoughts about how that would change the process or not?
Yeah, it kind of, I mean, I think it would scale, but again, it would just require an extension of trust. I think part of the reason that it works with a small team is also you get to know people really well, and you just kind of like, while initially, like when John started writing content, there's like this part of me that was like, it doesn't matter how good it was. It's just someone else writing content in your world. And I would scrutinize every single script and like change tiny words and be like, oh no, this is an anachronistic sentence. So I wouldn't have written it like this. And all of that is just bullshit, basically. Like it's kind of, I don't know, it's like possessive bullshit that you kind of have to let go. I mean, to be honest, this is probably not a politic confession, but there's actually bits of content that John wrote for the latest expansion that I haven't even read, which would have been unthinkable even for when we released it to begin with. But that's kind of, I think that's the space that you have to get to, of like extending trust to people and allowing them to create, because I think it gets better when you allow people to kind of write things that are meaningful to them and that work for them that you wouldn't have written. I mean, but that was also one of the great things that John said to me when he started writing. He also said, tell me if you really hate something, and that'll make the game better, and I'll change it, because, I was responsible for setting the tone. And that's like a really crazy thing to like tell someone, like here, like this is how you disagree with me. But it's a really important thing to do as well. And I think so if you keep those in mind, like extend trust, but also be willing to like have that debate with people and disagree with people, I think that's how you scale it, I guess. I mean, I don't know, it might all fall apart the moment you try and do something bigger. I almost kind of slightly pity anyone who tries to do anything bigger because I still feel so tired. But you know, good luck. Excellent. All right. I think that's me. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. That was beautiful.